So I'm very excited that today we were back with our Zebex Decarb lunch, first one of the fall. My name is Natalie Douglas, if I haven't had the pleasure of already meeting you. I'm the Zebex program manager, and I'm here today with my Zeke colleague, Stephanie Dallow, program manager of Carbon Leadership Forum BC. So today we're really thrilled to be able to chat with Bosa Properties and Chandos Construction about cost-effective strategies to cut embodied carbon. We've seen a huge amount of interest in this topic amidst a climate of budget cutting and financial uncertainty. And I'm really hopeful that this webinar is going to prove useful and compelling to those of you who are unsure of where to start, unconvinced that maybe the savings exist, or craving examples of where cost and carbon reductions are happening in action. And I'm really grateful for two leaders, Audrina Lim of Chandos and Ayden Kristmanson of Bosa, who have both been immensely willing to share their lessons and convince others in the industry to continue being part of the solution making. Now, to kick things off in a good way, I want to express my gratitude to be able to join you all today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and to be able to offer these decarb lunches for free because of the financial support of the City of Vancouver and BC Hydro. If you're interested in continuing education credits for attending today's session, you can see some information that my colleague Victoria is going to drop into the chat. As per usual, do use that chat to pose questions or make comments about the content in today's session. Maybe other folks in the audience will have equally as exquisite responses as those of us on the panel. More than once, I've been told that folks in our network have actually made connections through private messaging or public messaging in the Decarb Lunch chat. So again, this is your opportunity to make connections as well as stay engaged in the session. We'll draw questions from that chat as well at the end. So after the presentations from Ayden and Audrina, we're going to have 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to hear questions and answers from the content shared today. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to our first presenter, Ayden Kristmanson from Bosa. She's a sustainability specialist there and really excited to hear what she has to share. Over to you, Ayden.
Thank you, Natalie. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. We're here to really talk about, as Natalie said, how can we be aligning the cost side of things, either cost savings or increasing the revenue that you can see on your projects, but aligning that with embodied carbon. And how do we do that, but also aligning with our customer values and not taking away anything from our buildings that really makes it saleable. So let's dive right into it, and we'll take any questions at the end as well. All right, give it a second. So I'm gonna not talk about this part for very long because we have a very educated group here on the current climate conditions, but government of Canada by 2030 has asked or has pledged to reduce their emissions by 40 to 45% compared to the 2005 levels. And specifically in the building sector, they want to reduce 37% of our GHG emissions. And so when we think about embodied carbon, and this is really the guiding principle behind why certain regulations are being set. And when we look at the City of Vancouver and what they're currently doing on the emission side of things for reducing our buildings construction emissions, in 2023, they released the bylaw where we were all going to measure embodied carbon in new Part 3 buildings. So any buildings that were greater than 3 stories. What this did was it really allowed us to measure a baseline in terms of embodied carbon. And where they see the bylaw going and what they're proposing is a 10% reduction to this baseline building or less than 360 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for any Part 3 buildings. We see this at rezoning and we see this at building permit, but again, all of this leads back up to this 40% reduction that the city, but also our federal government is aiming to get to by 2030. So when we think about what we're measuring in terms of embodied carbon, again, just a refresher for this group and what we're really talking about here, asterisk before I begin, this is based on Bosa Properties data and what we've been measuring. So the percentages that you see here might shift depending on your organization and where you're building, but this is what we're seeing for our portfolio. We're really talking about everything from product manufacturing all the way to the end of life of a building. And this is over the 60 years of a building life cycle. We're seeing that operational energy is about 55% of our emissions right now. And obviously as retrofits happen and as our energy becomes cleaner, we'll see that drop. But our embodied carbon, when we look at it from the structure, enclosure, interiors, and services, it's broken up into these various percentages. And so how can we target these various areas, but also doing it in a cost-effective way? So that's what we're going to get into today. When we think about how the current GHG requirements and mandates impact the various different levels of the current business system. So we look at the federal government, we look at financial institutions and publicly traded companies. We see businesses like Bosa Properties, and then we have our end users as well. And what we see right now is that embodied carbon is often, or any GHG reporting, is often related to government and the businesses. There's not a lot that's happening on the end user side of things. And so what we're trying to understand is how can embodied carbon be related to our end user? Is there a way that we make this relevant to end users? Is there a way that we can make it relevant to the rest of our organization and really tack on this idea of embodied carbon reductions and cost savings to the work that we're doing in other areas of Bosa Properties? So thinking about our marketing teams, thinking about our customer teams, thinking about how we design our buildings and who we're designing for, how can we relate this? So what we're doing, sorry, before I get to that point, why are the end users really important and why is this important to look at? We have about 130,000 to 225,000 new homes that have to be built in Canada every year. So finding this balance between building more homes, but also reducing embodied carbon is something we're going to have to get to and something that has to become a priority when we think of real estate being, or residential construction specifically, being the highest emitting subsector across our whole provinces. So we have to find a way to, one, build with less impact, but also build with lower cost, plus build more. So finding the balance between all of these different levers is super important. When we look at currently, this is a study from the University of Toronto that I love, and I love the impact that it describes. It further proves the point that I just said earlier. But when we look at the 2018 data and we put that 40% reduction goal up against that, you get to, and I hope you can all see my mouse, but this is what comes out to the 40% reduction in what 2030 we've committed to. When you look at what actual annual construction demand is, we're actually way up here. And what we would actually have to reduce per home in terms of emissions would be 83% compared to that 40, just to reach the similar result to what we have previously committed to. So finding this balance of how do we get from the data that we've captured prior, but seeing this annual construction demand and then actually reducing our emissions by double what we've currently committed to is where we need to find some synergies, or is why we need to find some synergies, sorry. So when we look at what our customers are currently interested in paying for, this is some research that we've done around what our customer values in our buildings. The top 5 things often do not have to do with building design or things that can be related to embodied carbon. So we're looking at the location of the property, the quality of the building, the price of the property, and building security. Those are the top 4 things that they really care about, and also the interior design. But what can be related to both customer value and embodied carbon is 1, parking, 2, the amount of amenities, and then 3, the exterior design of the building. And so how can we relate embodied carbon to these customer values, but without taking away from what our customer wants, but making it more efficient? So 1, we don't have to pay for as much of the materials, and 2, we can still see that revenue boost from providing what our customers really value. So what I'm going to do is, walk you through the different levers that we took to, 1, reduce embodied carbon, but also really reduce our hard costs across a few different projects. So this was a great example. When we look at our parking, we're trying to get as efficient as possible for our below grade. Below grade embodied carbon is massive across projects. Many of you probably know this, but when you look at total embodied carbon below grade, if you were to have no parking at all, you'd probably cut your embodied carbon by almost in half in high-rise multifamily buildings. So what we did is we said, okay, how can we possibly remove as many parking levels but have the same amount of parking? So we really tried to get efficient with our core. We repositioned the core and had 3 of the elevators extend to the parkade, but then only 2 elevators to a soft core. So that allowed for more space to be available to realize 4 more additional parking stalls per floor, which then resulted in 32 additional stalls. What happened is this then, sorry, there we go. What happened is we then also moved our columns back, which allowed for 56 additional stalls of parking total for the whole project, which then resulted, combined with flipping the core, allowed for an entire parkade floor to be eliminated. The amount of carbon that can be reduced for one parkade floor is incredible. We'll get into the actual metrics later, but eliminating one excavation depth is super impactful. Another piece that we were looking at is removing any double height spaces in our parkade as well. We had electrical rooms and waste rooms moved to grade, so this double height space that you see here could be eliminated, and again, reducing excavation depth as well. The third thing we're looking at is massing complexity, and a ratio that we use is the amount of enclosure, or sorry, the space of enclosure for the enclosed space. And what you see in this green box, and I hope you all can see this well enough, but what you see on the green outline here is an articulated facade that we made more efficient by just moving it to a square box. And what this does is it reduces the amount of materials that are needed to actually build the outside of your building. Very simple principle, but it really reduces the amount of embodied carbon. So again, simplifying your design, also saving on hard costs. The similar to this last discussion, the amount of balcony space, very straightforward. Are we over designing our balcony space for our customers? We're not saying get rid of balconies, but we're saying how much balcony space is actually needed. For this specifically, when we looked at the total outdoor space versus the interior space, we had about an 18% outdoor space for the floor area, versus when we reduced our balcony space slightly, we got to 15. And again, looking at these ratios, trying to understand what aligns with our customer values, how much space do they want, but what also can we see in terms of getting more efficient to, one, reduce our hard costs, and then also reduce embodied carbon. That's right. There we go. Another level that we used was our common circulation space for the corridors inside our buildings. Again, super simple, but let's not over design the inside of our circulation spaces. So meeting to code, making sure we're not making hallways larger than they need to be, but also aligning to what our customers value. Do they need a larger hallway for XYZ reason? Can we design to what is just enough and what is needed or what is valued by the customer? Again, it reduces materials and allows you to realize more space. Sorry, more space for your saleable area. So what we're looking at here in total savings, when we look at all those efficiency levers, keeping the number of units all the same, and looking at the overall efficiencies in terms of our typical floor, but also building efficiency, we can see a 10% reduction in embodied carbon with just those levers. What we get to, and what we're looking at internally right now, is the embodied carbon per unit. It's a great metric for us to compare, while keeping the amount of units the same, how are we really reducing in terms of that livable area per household? And so again, you see that 10% reduction. When we look at the hard cost savings, and this is where the conversation became extremely relevant and super useful for our different teams internally when trying to convince people that, embodied carbon reductions doesn't have to come at a cost premium. It's actually a cost savings. We saw 12.5 million savings in hard costs. And then when you evaluate this with your profit over cost, we saw an increase of 6% as well. So starting to change this narrative that, embodied carbon is not a cost premium when you're trying to get these reductions. There's simple design principles that you can use internally to make sure that you're realizing those cost savings as well. I might leave it there. I have a thank you slide, but I realize we are perfectly on time, and I realize that was fast. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat. But I'm super excited to introduce Audrina, who's going to take you through the second part of this webinar and take you through some project examples. And I will leave it to her to have an intro for herself as well. Audrina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ayden. That's actually an awesome presentation. I'm totally taking notes to bring back to our pre-construction teams. Hi, everyone. My name's Audrina Lim. I'm from Chandos Construction. My position there is the Director of Sustainable Construction. we do a lot of cool stuff. Being a B Corp certified, we have a mandate to reduce our emissions. Our target currently is net zero by 2040 on our operational emissions. And we've signed up to the net zero challenge for 2050, which also looks at our embodied carbon purchasing. So we want to actually start to look at how we can implement lower carbon strategies on our projects. What we're also seeing is that some of these activities also save us on costs, either cost neutral or have some actual cost savings. And I'm going to take you through some of these today. There's 3 projects we're going to present, and they're going to be very quick fire because we only have 15 or so minutes. But again, also let us know if you've got questions. I'll follow up in the chat. Okay, let's see if it's moving. So the first one we're going to present is Bella Coola stainless steel pool. Very new to Canada, but it's been around for about 50 years of technological development in Europe. And we've actually started, we're about to complete this one in the next week or 2. And we're actually under construction on our second pool in Enderby. So I wanted to take a look at this embodied carbon study and give you guys a little bit of insight. So because this was a prefabricated pool, we could install this into a remote area location, and we were able to also save on embodied carbon and schedule, which means saving on our GCs, which is huge. Like when we talk about saving on schedule, we're talking about mobilization costs, insurance, everything. So the shorter we can keep our schedules, the better. Oh, sorry, I'll just go back a bit. You can see how the stainless steel pool comes together. It's a bit of a different look, but everything comes in pre-welded and pre-sealed. So you actually have a quality control measure that allows you to go fast. So I'll just move on. So Bella Coola is by road about 1,000 kilometers away from Vancouver. And for us to mobilize, we had to plan early and coordinate well in advance. So a lot of pre-construction time is critical, and a lot of detailed review and coordination with our subtrades, our consultants, and our supply chain partners. So all of this happened right before we started to mobilize. And we also selected people so that we could have an efficient logistics to get to the site. So being flat packed, you can see the picture there. It could all be shipped in. So it took 3 sea cans to put all the material together that was shipped out of Europe. So this is German fabricated pool. So it had German 316 stainless steel, flat packed in these systems, and we just flew out some specialty welders to come in on the site and actually assemble it. We typically would see a 6-month construction period on a pool for their environment, for all the concrete and everything like that. But this allowed us 2 months of savings on that schedule, which was pretty incredible because of its remote area location and the ability to get materials on that site. So because we saved the 2 months, we were able to avoid our heat and hoarding condition for the concrete pour through the winter, which saves an estimated 20,000 litres of diesel, which we would have had to transport as well. And when you look at that, just in the diesel alone, we would have saved about 53 metric tonnes of carbon emissions. In addition to that, we were able to shorten our exposure on site, limit our environmental potential for spills or any kind of mishaps. So overall, the less time, more savings, more safety, more wins for all of us. So this is a little bit about where our schedule ended up. The excavation, demolition, and setup started on December the 3rd. By February, we were able to do strip footings because it's a lighter pool. It doesn't have as deep foundation requirements. We were able to mount the whole pool on very limited concrete, which was critical for this site. The pool arrived on the 26th, and within 16 days, all the walls of the pool were installed. And then the schedule allowed for 9 more days for the pool base to come in and get installed as well on a gravel base. So we didn't need concrete. It had some thickening, but that's about it. And then it would have taken another 7 days for the final cleaning. So instead of 6 months, it took 6 weeks to build the actual pool itself. And on October the 2nd is when we're looking at handover with full commissioning completed. So when we look at this, the embodied carbon reductions, I did an LCA takeoff on the stainless steel pool versus what would have been a traditional concrete pool build. We saved about 68% reduction on embodied carbon in materials alone. And that is primarily due to material efficiency of concrete. We still need concrete, but we didn't have to use as much of it. I also tracked the 10,000 kilometers of shipping and on the road as well with the LCA, on one-click LCA. And these results were super surprising to us. So overall on this project, the wins were superb. We could build in a remote area. We could have embodied carbon savings on the materials, just in material efficiency. We can also look at a schedule savings, 6 weeks for the pool itself versus 6 months. And we had put in an allowance of 75,000 on heating and hoarding allowance for fuels, and we saved all of that as well, which is incredible. So the next project we're going to present is the UVic, National Centre for Indigenous Laws. It was a really interesting project. It was already designed to be mass timber and super low carbon. However, they took a look at the site materials and thought we could actually see if we can go one step further. So this is the site. You can see it's quite forested around the Fraser building. On the south and the southeast, we're actually looking at doing the addition, where you can see how it tucks in. So a lot of the existing forestry was going to be removed. So there was a total of about 73 mature trees on site, and 43 had to be removed predominantly due to either construction or its health and structural condition. So a lot of this encapsulated carbon survives in these trees, and the team looked at like, okay, well, how do we turn this into an opportunity? So for a cost neutral outcome, they were able to, just taking a look at how the site looked before demolition and what we're currently developing there. It's about to be handed over soon too. We looked at the amount of materials that was going to be included in the design. And to just do some volume takeoffs, we were looking at about 125 cubic meters of lumber for the vertical columns. By using a different approach, by using solid logs, we were able to get a really nice traditional approach for the vernacular of material and also for its look. But it's also a lot lower embodied carbon in terms of how much process it needs to turn it into a structural material. So 34 logs were salvaged from the site demolition of the trees, and that equates to about 24 cubic meters. So we had to sort them out to make sure that they were structurally adequate and the scale and the size would still fit to the design itself as well. And you can see some of our open space AI shots. You can see how these logs were just integrated so naturally into the building, and it really enhanced its architecture as well. The outcome for us was 20% of the material volume was salvaged from the site on the columns itself. So 34 out of 116 designed logs were actually harvested from the site. By utilizing logs, we noted about 50% less embodied carbon weighting to the whole LCA. So you can see here, just if we were looking at glulam produced in British Columbia versus just a dried conifer, it's about double. So for us to utilize also free material that we would have had to taken off the site, there are an abundance of savings, and I'm still in the middle of working through how we calculate that and how we demonstrate that on an LCA. But the remainder balance of the logs were also sourced locally from BC. So they continued that articulation instead of having to use glulams, and they used the mass fabricated timber on things like CLT instead. So we could really balance a little bit more of the embodied carbon. Last but not least, this is actually a curveball from Alberta, sunny Alberta. This was a really interesting project for us because this is something where we looked at cost savings and we looked at trying to speed up the schedule. And what came out of this was a significant win. So for us, this was an IGA in rural regional Alberta, about 45 minutes outside of the city limits of Calgary. So we had a common goal. This was a fundraised project. So a lot of fundraised money from the parishioners and the community. We had to be really respectful of their budget. We also wanted to look at their schedule. This was actually previously with a different GC, and they came to us because they couldn't deliver within that time frame. And we looked at how do we optimize our schedule to deliver on time. It was a collaborative contract, so a CCDC 5B, which enabled us to to look at the design before we started on site. And this was critical because we had really great design partners and really great sub-trades that we could put our heads together to look for wins. So having an open environment of discourse allowed us to find innovation together and actually enact on it without any crazy battles. It was just like, hey, this is our goal. We had a values alignment and we understood the mission. So you could see here typically for what you would see is the original rendering and the final outcome. We didn't lose anything in terms of quality, but what we did do was save $256,000 on this build, which went back to the parishioners for their programs, right? This is back to their good work that they're doing for their community. In addition to this, we saved a total of 146 metric tons of emissions through different things like avoided emissions on a schedule, avoided emissions on heating and hoarding, and things like material efficiency. 73% alone of that savings was from material efficiency. And we also managed to find 2-month direct schedule savings as well. So more GC savings in addition to that. So how we did it was looking at the deep foundations. This was an existing building we had to work with a very constrained site. You can see what it looked like when we started to do the business as usual. We had to pause and say, look, we can't actually continue this because it's not a safe site to operate on. It's actually going to slow us down, and we're finding all these other issues that were unforeseen. So we took a look at things with the design team and the sub-trades and said, what can we do differently here? How do we make the site more safe? How can we optimize? So by going to screw piles and alternative foundations for shallow foundations, we were able to find a huge amount of savings and consolidate our schedule too. We could do concurrent work, and I'll show you how. So by looking at how the original designs were laid out, the green became slab thickenings instead of deep foundations. We really challenged the design team and the engineering, and we were able to convert these into very minimal shallow environments. The blue was the original design solution that we had to do because there was some undergrounds that we had to remove and cap. So we had to excavate through those anyway, but we were able to also optimize a little bit on that western run. And the yellow was originally deep foundations that we turned into screw piles. So this changed how the site turned out and how much material we had to remove and replace. So we take a look at, this was the coverage of how much slab we would have had to cut out to excavate safely and how much we would have had to replace. The blue there was just how much we ended up actually taking out to do the undergrounds. And what turned out from the original image there with the deep foundations to what we had to implement for just excavating on point loads for the shallow screw piles, we were able to actually then have a much safer site, much more open site, and we actually saved on a ton of materials. So we didn't have to excavate, cut out as much. We saved on a lot of equipment time. And because it was a lot safer, we could actually speed up the overhead work in addition to installing all the other components that needed to happen. So we're able to push that by 2 months. And from that acceleration, our material reductions, we did a bit of a takeoff and calculation. We saved 107.5 metric tons of embodied carbon just in the concrete and rebar alone. We did have to add the steel core piling, so it was just the screw piles, but everything else you can see is tallied up, and we ran it through one-click LCA, and we were so surprised by the results. And this is down to material efficiency and really optimizing your design on foundations. I put a little equivalency there. I'm sure you guys are all pretty clued into how much a metric ton of carbon saved is. For our activity savings, so it's hard to measure avoided emissions when you haven't executed on something that you can measure. But what we did was we looked at what we could measure. We know that hauling concrete away is about 10,000 kilos per haul. And we also measured the location of where the recycling receiving facilities were. We were able to do that calculation using the Green Freight Handbook, which is a really great tool if you're looking at that, that strategy of how to calculate distance in short ton miles. So we did all the conversions and we measured it, and we were able to look at 12 metric tons of savings just in that movement alone of hauling the waste off of the site. So adding on to that, like we're slowly looking at how to do these things so we can get metrics, so we can plan our own emissions reduction strategy on our operations. And then for the schedule reductions, and I mentioned this earlier, because we were able to fast track the overhead work, we could rebuild that roofing that needed to be redone at the same time, and we avoided a ton of heating and hoarding conditions, about 5 weeks. So I did a quick takeoff, and I was on the conservative side here. I only looked at savings on one 400,000 BTU heater. That was actually with propane. So when we looked at how many hours this would have run, its efficiency rating on our standard heaters, we were able to save 26.64 metric tons of emissions, which is super exciting for us because we can then use this unit of measure and deploy that across all our winter heating and hoarding plans and really challenge the team. Can we accelerate schedule? Because this is how much money you'll save. This is how much carbon you'll save. And this for us is going to be how we navigate our future reductions as well. So I think I've blitzed through that pretty fast. But in summary, I think there are some key takeaways for us. Being creative and really finding different solutions and challenging all team members to work collaboratively, this demonstrates savings for us on carbon emissions and on costs. We always look for that because the myth is that sustainability costs more. And I'd like to challenge that notion. And I'd like to challenge everyone today to try and find these opportunities to prove that wrong, right? Prove that sustainability actually saves you money. I also think that having more time up front to really, dissect and rework and understand what's actually just us doing business as usual, or can we do something better? Investing a little bit more upfront can save a ton more money, schedule, and costs at the end, as well as embodied carbon. So these are all things that are tied together. We need to look at the value in our existing materials and our existing assets and look at how do we see that differently instead of saying, oh, it's cheaper to demolish or it's cheaper to throw it away. We need to look at that and say, one day these are going to be worth so much more. Why don't we try and integrate that now? And we want to be able to use LCA tools to actually start to ask those questions, or maybe start to bring in and introduce a different metric of thinking. So for us being able to do this, we can actually now be proactive in the future about how we strategize our construction. And one thing that I think Zeke and ZebX is doing really well is being able to share our lessons learned with our industry. Because if we have more adoption of these strategies, it becomes our new business as usual. And I think this is the way of the future, is we have to work more optimized. We have to find ways to bring construction costs down so housing becomes more affordable, infrastructure becomes more affordable, and we don't have negative impacts to the environment while we grow. So yeah, that's pretty much it from me. I'll hand it back over to Natalie. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks so much. Both of you guys are so efficient at getting through your presentations. Love it. Lots of time for questions. There has been a lot of activity in the chat. I did, considering you moved through that so quickly, I know, Audrina, you wanted the opportunity to talk about the collaboration across construction in Canada. Do you want to take the opportunity just now to speak about that?
Absolutely. That's awesome. So thanks. There's me and my counterparts in all the large national contractors have actually been kind of asking each other, hey, how are you seeing this? What hurdles are you facing? And we've created a little bit of a group that we kind of share our hard lessons learned so that we avoid waste. We avoid asking ourselves, we have the same vendors, like we work with everybody. And what's been really interesting is we will launch this soon, but there will be a release that we've done our own study on our track towards net zero as a collective. And we looked at what are our easy levers? Where are we actually at as a baseline? And is it true that it's only 6% on our LCA allocated to construction emissions? We're starting to believe that that's actually more. But what are we measuring? And we're working together on all of the different strategies on the lofty goals and also the low-hanging fruit. So keep your eyes out. There's going to be a launch of that in the next couple of weeks, and that's going to be presented throughout the industry, and you guys will probably see it in one forum or another. And we encourage more discussion and discourse and asking for better. And we want to challenge all industry partners to try and find ways to work together and simplify, automate, and remove hurdles towards a low carbon sector. And this is where we want to be. Yeah.
That's great and very heartening. I think, again, I just keep on having more and more questions. But before I move over to Ayden, I do have one follow-up just because Forrest threw something in the chat and I think it connects really well to what you were just speaking about. Is like, why does Chandos care? Like, what about your sustainability commitments relates to embodied carbon? You are a B Corp, but how does that connect back to why you track embodied carbon and do these whole building life cycle assessments?
Well, part of our B Corp requirements is that we actually have to report our GHG emissions according to the GHG protocol. And so scope 1 and 2, scope 1, I think for everyone who might not be familiar, scope 1 is all our use of fuels, our combustible fuels. Scope 2 is our use of purchased energy. So for us, we contain that as our operational carbon. Those are the things that we know we have impact on directly because we pay for those bills and we see how much comes through the door. For scope 3, this is all the things that are very difficult to measure, and that includes all the materials we procure. We need to understand what that looks like because we have to report on that. Now, every single project that we build, soon we're going to have to find a way to not just do a cost-based estimate, but to do an actual impact of our embodied carbon on the materials we procure, which is challenging because we have to purchase what's being designed, what's being asked for in specifications. So we are looking at ways on how we can optimize as much as possible that allows us to do collaborative construction so that we can have the say at the beginning. And for us, because we've committed to the net zero challenge, we're never going to be able to do this without offsets. And offsets cost us money. So for us, how do we optimize before we have to start paying for offsets? So for us, this is all part of our research and the navigation. And also we care about our communities. So sourcing local, looking for opportunities where we can reduce carbon, reduce emissions that impact our local environment, inhalants, even keeping our staff on site safe. All of these things are quite integrated into that goal. So for us, sourcing materials, understanding the materials, understanding our embodied carbon impact, these are all critical, not just to the B Corp, to our net zero challenge, but also to us as how we have our values that drive our organization. And this is why I joined Chandos, actually. It's one of the main reasons why I left the profession in architecture to move to an organization that's trying to do something different. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Audrina. Over to Ayden. I think that there has been a lot of questions connecting to what, Audrina, you actually said at the end of your presentation about moving beyond business as usual and what is business as usual. Ayden, there was a question from Lucas, and again, I think Sean asked a similar question about why, as a profit-driven company, many of those solutions seem like they should just be standard, and what part of that value engineering, like why is this novel? Isn't this just standard? And Audrina, you can jump in afterwards and reflect on why potentially some of these things aren't standard.
Totally. I'm gonna share my screen again because we laughed, all of us together, when we first saw this graph because everyone loves this graph, and I love the build nothing because that's so funny for a private developer. But when you look at this graph and what it's really telling you, I really appreciate the intersection between these different pieces at the bottom. And I think I fully
You're not
agree.
sharing, just to
I'm not sharing.
Yeah, not sharing quite yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're really building up.
I was really close. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's coming through.
It's there. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. And I've blown it up so we can just look at this graph. But the build nothing versus build effectively or efficiently. What I'm really talking about is the build clever / build less. And I think what's so key here is this timeline that's at the bottom. And when are we inserting this design efficiency discussion throughout the project phase and life cycle? You're not going into a project that's about to go into construction and saying, hey, we're gonna design everything differently now. It's something that I think this is why it is not just common sense and common knowledge between all builders. It's something that is so complex in terms of timing, in terms of who is involved in these decisions, in terms of who is your champion internally that is talking with your consultants, your architects, your structural engineers. Who is that person that's saying, hey, great, we have V1 of what we're looking at, but we actually also have to reduce our embodied carbon by 10%. Like, what is our pathway to getting there? And can we do it early enough where we can show the design efficiency? And I'm glad Forrest is here because we've talked so much about this, but how can we get there without just swapping materials? Like, we got to get beyond that. We got to start building better, or in this version, building clever, because again, it's not that clever. It's basic building efficiency. You're thinking, how can I use less? And so I think why this hasn't been talked about before in the sustainability world, I think, is because this tie between cost savings and embodied carbon just has not been there. And it takes a lot of data. We're very fortunate at Bosa, where we've done so much work on the data collections of our previous projects and our future projects around what is the average hard cost, where I mean, we can break out in between like the structure and the enclosure, what I showed at the beginning there, but we have so much data on hand where we can actually start to do these comparisons, do our LCAs. I'll do a quick plug to Tangible. Thank you to them for allowing us to do such reiterative versions of LCAs, and quickly seeing, okay, if we take this version of the building versus this version where we did the design efficiency levers that I showed, we saw this much of savings. And so it's more complicated than what I just showed on the screen. I think it took us a year to get to this sort of presentation. It's the data collection, it's the cost comparisons, it's working with your suppliers. And luckily, internally, we have an internal construction team, we have an internal design team, we have all the people that can really help us build out this type of case study. But I think that's why it hasn't been standard practice across every organization. Is it to build this type of case study, you've got to have the right information. And so that's why we're sharing this, is that we've done the case study. If you're able to just talk to your suppliers, or sorry, your consultants, and say, hey, these are basic practices that we want to see from initial design to X date. And we want to be able to track these savings. So when we go to the City of Vancouver for permitting, we can say, hey, these are the steps that we've taken. This is just what we're trying to communicate and what we're trying to get to. And again, you can do your own analysis internally around what that hard cost savings is. And that's an even better lever to use with your internal teams to say, hey, this is why I'm saying let's pause for a second and think about this design. There's an actual huge cost savings if we just go back at this for one more time to do an evaluation. I think there was a question in the chat, and I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time on this, but there was a question around pull it back up. Sorry. There was a question on, oh, I'll find it and I'll address it later, but it all really ties back to like, how can we keep communicating to our teams why this is important, and really tying it back to that hard cost just has not been possible until LCA modeling can be done quickly. And so I think we're getting there. It's now just sharing these case studies and sharing these examples with the rest of the industry, so we know that that's the direction that we all need to be going.
Totally agree, Ayden. I think exactly on point. We just need to start thinking differently. We need to start being able to put a different metric and a different lens as we evaluate our decision processes and how we progress and how we actually even design together. I think having everyone at the table is going to be fantastic. Everyone has such different backgrounds and such different lenses. And I think this is really incredible for us to start looking at all encompassing, like stretching that line that we draw around projects and what we measure. And I think this is going to be so necessary for us to actually have that impact and maybe start to challenge our existing structures, our existing contract obligations, and maybe even eliminate some of those nasty lump sums. Like, are they truly effective? Like, we have to start asking ourselves, are lump sums truly effective for us to get these wins? Because then you're locked in. You don't find ways to get cost savings when you're in lump sum. I think we have to start pushing the scale on both sides. So,
yeah, thank you, Audrina. Thank you, Ayden. I think it's a really good point, and sometimes we get locked in with these things, and you really need to bring people together and earlier on in the project so that you can start to address those higher impact strategies, Aiden, as you were just showing on the slide right there. So then to build on these complex solutions, Audrina, this one is more for you. It's a lot of questions were coming in, wanting more answers about the logs that were reused. And so, as it relates to the design efficiencies with that, can you talk to, there were a few questions, some of them, one, from Sal was specifically to the tools that were used to conduct the LCA, and maybe you can speak to how reuse, you were able to model that in the tools you were using. Roberta was asking about the sign off on the logs, which kind of had to related to what Emily was asking about the structural engineers' opinions on which logs can be used. And Sarah was asking about, how that process was from the structural engineers to know which ones were had the structural integrity that was required to be used in the applications that they were. So if you can speak to that, and maybe just building on that too, having that as part of the approach to your design, any insights you can also share about how that's put into your specifications would also be really great.
Oh, well, I think this was a collaborative project. So it actually preceded me joining the company. So this was in the works a long time before I joined the company. So there was already some discussions that I wasn't privy to. But what I can tell you was the trees had to be removed. And this is an important project for Indigenous peoples nationally. So they wanted to be respectful of the environment in which they were building on. So I think naturally that conversation came up. The ability to use the logs we went through a lot of testing. So I was digging through all of the documentation on the team's projects. There was a lot of evaluation. Arborists came in. Then they had evaluators looking at trees, assessing all of the logs, assessing even if the tree needed to be removed or protected. There was a ton of process around that. And I think the owner being very flexible with that and being open to that is also a huge key. So it takes everyone. We're talking about just AEC. We got to talk about the owners wanting to be different, wanting to do something special. And I think that takes that is every time over. We want to look for those sorts of clients to work with. Someone who's going to be willing to put a little bit more time on there so that we can look at solutions and look at how these things are done. So with the case of the logs, it's no different from us going to a forestry environment and harvesting logs and evaluating them as well, because they're growing naturally. They have to be evaluated if they have rot, if they grew well, if they have structural capacity. So then they get tested. But they can also look at, they're all Douglas fir. The ones that they salvaged were Douglas fir, and that's what they evaluated through the arborist. They looked at the health of the log, and they actually started looking at its application. So I wasn't involved in that, but there were a lot of reports that I was digging through to look at structural capacity and the assumptions that were passed through. So I could actually connect, if you guys are interested, send me a list of emails, and I can get our team to speak to who was involved. Maybe they can take you through that process, and I can see if the team will be okay to share the specification verbiage. That would be really interesting, and maybe we can get that more and more out there. So there's a lot of variables in this. May not be applied to every site, but imagine if we had a heavily forested site that you have to expand on, what could be done with that existing lumber? I tried to do that on another site. I won't disclose where, but the thinking on that one was the owner just wanted to get the trees off the site. So he just gave it away as firewood. And I was like, okay, but we could have used that for your construction. That would have saved you a whole ton of money because lumber comes at a premium right now. But just, all these different factors that we're probably not privy to, it puts complexities in. So if you can have that conversation early, again, having everything up front, saying, hey, you know what? This team did it here. How can we do this on this site? That's enough to unlock a conversation. And for us, we encourage you guys to come back and tell us more about you finding those opportunities too.
Yeah. And kind of just back to what Lucas was saying, and even Anna had a comment just about the cost savings when you bring that embodied carbon lens. I feel like a lot of a lot of concerns are being raised about how embodied carbon and regulations can lead to cost increases. And I think maybe it's really something of a point that we really need to emphasize of how actually bringing the embodied carbon lens can really lead to cost savings. And so, with the example of reusing lumber that's being removed otherwise. So yeah, I think that's great. And then just to the point, I don't know if you, maybe I missed it, but just to the LCA tool that you were using, would you be able to share that?
Yeah, I'm still learning on how to categorize this one, right? That's why I haven't released the LCA report. That I'm just learning it. Like, okay, I'm going through the different WBLCA guidelines and like, how do I report this? And that's one of my bigger questions that I've raised in different forums, like CLF Alberta. We talked about this just the other day. Like, how do we find ways to qualify material that's either secondhand or used, or and I'm not a certified practitioner myself. We're just doing this according to the guidelines. I had the LCA one-click training, but what I was really interested in is how do we make this accessible? How do we make this easy for everybody to be able to do that measurement themselves? We do this internally because we want to gauge it, but we also want to be able to understand how do we make this open? How do we make this classifiable? And how do we tackle nuance? That's going to be difficult. And I think for us, as the guidelines develop, as regulatory teams start to understand what hurdles are easily removed, we'll find a way to get there. And I think the PCR rules will probably start to clarify. I probably need to do more research about that myself before I start releasing like, hey, this is what we're doing. All I do is I measure the closest EPD I can find to the industry standard, and then I'll apply that to the quantity. I can do quantities. I can do where it comes from, but a lot of the specifics and the data set, it's outside of my control. And I think this is where we need to have a conversation as a whole across industries, like how do we measure these things? So
No, I
I
agree.
haven't answered it, but
And for the reused materials in particular, I know that the City of Vancouver guidelines and maybe Forrest, if you want to jump in, correct me, but I believe the national guidelines are also saying that reclaimed materials that are being used, those do not need to be modeled or like act as zero towards your overall emissions. So like even within the beam tool that we're using on Part 9 buildings, we still want people to model and put the quantity, but show that as having no impact, just so we know the volume of the materials being used and how much. So it'd be good to see that. And also, I did notice that your emissions reporting that Ayden that you shared had a 1% for the end of life emissions. I was curious about that because I'm curious about like even for biogenic materials like reclaimed lumber, if the end of life scenario is going to be waste or incineration, that would be higher and might have a higher emission. So I don't mean to jump in though, because Natalie, I should hand it back to you to take the next question. But I don't know, Ayden, if you wanted to just really quickly address the 1%.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with high rise. So when we look at the impact of everything else compared to end of life, it's not even close. So, I mean, it's different across building types. You just have to evaluate. And again, it's based on Bosa Properties data. So again, do your own analysis internally. Don't take what I'm saying for verbatim, but every building type is different. Every use type is different. Every height, this is what's so hard about embodied carbon. You really need to study what you're building and what your organization, or if you're a consultant, what you're helping people build. So yeah, it's different across the board.
Thanks so much. I feel like we could talk about this for a very long time, but we're nearing the end of the hour and Audrina has somewhere important to be afterwards. So we're going to keep it very prompt at a conclusion at 1 p.m. So I'll ask a final question, trying to wrap up a couple of things. So I think a lot of the pieces that have been highlighted are, having the staff to actually think through the embodied carbon associated, having trained staff that can apply this lens, instituting IDP and integrated design processes that can sometimes add upfront cost, and that is a reality. But maybe once you build that capacity, the costs decrease because you've already built the system. And if you're able to repeat that over and over on different projects, you can reach the cost savings. So there is an upfront cost and then navigating that space. And so reflecting on some of the questions about where the state we are right now, what are your thoughts on what needs to change in the industry to realize those embodied carbon savings? What systemic changes need to happen, specifically as it relates to embodied carbon reduction? And maybe where does that overlap with operational savings?
I can start. I think it really depends what your role is in the industry. I mean, on the private developer side of things, I agree with you. The education slash who is talking about this in your organization and who is bringing this to the table is super important. But it really starts with conversations. Like when we started this work 2.5 years ago, it was never talked about before, and that was something that it takes time. You gotta introduce it to your teams. You're gonna hear no, and then you gotta bring it up again, and you gotta say, okay, I heard you the first time, but what about if we look at it from a cost lens and just start speaking that language that is not shoving sustainability down people's throats? Like start shoving cost savings down people's throats, and then they're gonna listen. And I think it's so important to start talking to developer, depending on your role, but talk to developers, talk to whoever your owner is, in the language that they want to talk to. And I think it's such a skill to be able to translate sustainability, or in this case, embodied carbon, to the language of the people who are ultimately making the decisions. And for us, the big win was, I mean, design efficiency. We have an internal design team. So championing that idea that design efficiency can really result in embodied carbon savings is huge. But also letting the team know that, hey, you're already doing the right things. You guys are the ones that are flagging these design efficiencies. You're already doing it. It's just about communicating it and working with Forrest and letting him know, like, hey, these are the things that we're looking at, and this is how we're going to reduce our embodied carbon because of it. When you look at the construction side of things, sorry, and then I'll pass it to you, Audrina, but the talking with your suppliers, I think talk about concrete. You got to get in with your suppliers. You got to say, hey, we're looking to reduce embodied carbon. What are the different concrete swaps that we can use below grade to, I mean, not impact our construction schedule, but to really just see what the embodied carbon savings are on that side. We've done that analysis, design efficiency, champions, anything that can be found on concrete efficiency. So again, like just talking with your teams and getting them on board to say, hey, these are the conversations we're having. What do you think? What have you been seeing with your other clients, etc.? It just starts with talking with everyone and explaining your priorities, and then talking in their language too.
I feel like that echoes initially what you were speaking about. You started
Totally.
your presentation talking about value. You have to understand what your team values and speak in that language. Audrina?
100% echoing that. Yeah, it's all about the business case. And if you can find a business case, you can, I hate to use this term, but you can almost Trojan horse embodied carbon savings. But at the same time, when you surprise them with things like, hey, guess what your outcome was? And it wasn't hard, and you saved money and you saved schedule, and everyone came out learning something different. These are the benefits. And honestly, like in the 3 years I've been with Chandos, it's been incredible to see that evolution. Our team has had education about it, but now they're really starting to adopt it. They're starting to ask questions. That comprehension is actually coming through, and we just need to give it time, and we need to not make it inaccessible. We need to be able to bring everybody to the table and make it softer, make it approachable, and not be scary. And I think for us, we also do a little, our teams are super competitive. So we say, you know, like we put little challenges, like our waste diversion right now is we track all our waste across our sites. Some of these performance things are tied to the bonuses. So it's actually pretty cool if you can incentivize it. It's actually pretty cool if you can educate gently and you can say, here's how we can actually do stuff and here are the outcomes. And whatever out of these 5 things that we get that are your priorities, guess what? These things are all linked together. And then it becomes a holistic conversation. And we can include sub-trades. We can share that around. We can bring in owners. We can bring in design teams. We can bring in supply chain teams to actually want to join that train. And that's where we're moving towards anyway.
Yeah, cheery place to end. Thanks so much, Audrina. I can definitely speak firsthand, but that both Audrina and Ayden are lovely collaborators. So do reach out to both of them if you have further questions. I know we were not able to answer all the questions, but that's the best circumstance that we're in, that there's so much engagement in the chat. I just wanted to thank you guys both so much for sharing your thoughts on the topic and for folks being so engaged in the chat. I will note that our next Decarb lunch is on October 9th. It's on cooling and thermal safety in MURBs. So go sign up for that. And thank you again, everyone, for your active participation. It's as good as all of you guys come and bring your energy. So thank you so much.